Béla Miklós de Dálnok, A Life in the Shadow of Upheaval. Welcome to Hungarology, your channel for a deep dive into Hungarian history. Today, we are looking at a figure who has almost completely disappeared from collective memory. Colonel General and later Prime Minister Béla Miklós de Dálnok. Part 1. Introduction and Disclaimer. When we examine his life, we do not encounter the archetype of a strong, decisive statesman. Rather, history shows us a character who often appeared weak, hesitant, and almost passive in his political role. He was a man swept to the top by a massive power vacuum, never possessing the necessary political strength or a power base of his own. Throughout his life, he remained driven by circumstances, a mere transitional figure during one of Hungary's darkest hours. Before we dive deep into his life path, an important note on the methodology of this video is necessary. Our goal today is not to present a modern historical analysis. Instead, we rely deliberately and exclusively on one specific source, the biography by author Dr. Mihály Korom. It is crucial to understand that this material is deeply rooted in Hungary's socialist historiography. This means we are reproducing the original tone, the specific valuations, and the ideological classification of this source in this video to create an authentic contemporary witness. This video shows how Béla Miklós de Dálnok was seen and evaluated from the perspective of the system of that time. The terms and views used in the script correspond to the source and by no means represent the personal opinion or the political views of our channel, Hungarology. We invite you to view this video as a window into the political documentation of a past era. Part 2. Origins and Formation, 1890 to 1910. Béla Miklós de Dálnok was born on June 11, 1890 in Budapest. He descended from a minor noble Sheckler family which, however, possessed no significant landed property. His father served as an official in the civil service, representing a social stratum that depended entirely on the state apparatus for its existence. For a young man from this class, the Hungary of the late 19th century offered almost no opportunities for advancement other than service in the military or the state administration. After attending the gymnasium in Sopron, he entered the renowned Ludovica Academy in 1907. This training was the defining moment for his later career. The Ludovica was the cadet school of Hungarian militarism, where young officers were instilled with unconditional loyalty to the House of Habsburg and a strictly conservative worldview. When Béla Miklós de Dálnok graduated as a lieutenant of the Hussars in 1910, he was a perfectly functioning cog in an apparatus that primarily secured the interests of the ruling class. At that time, he lacked any understanding of the social tensions and the desperate needs of the broad layers of the population. He was a dutiful officer, shaped by a system that placed absolute obedience above critical thinking. Part 3. Rise in the Horthy regime, 1914 to 1930. The First World War formed the first major turning point in the career of Béla Miklós de Dálnok. He served on various fronts, gaining experience in traditional cavalry and staff work. But the truly decisive years for his further path were those following the collapse of the monarchy in 1918. After the political turmoil of the Hungarian Soviet Republic and the following chaos, Béla Miklós de Dálnok joined the newly formed National Army under the leadership of Miklós Horthy. His rise within this new, counter-revolutionary system was steady and characterized by absolute loyalty and the dutiful performance of tasks. Between 1920 and 1921, he graduated from the General Staff Academy, which gave him access to the highest military decision-making levels of the country. In 1929, he was awarded the title of Vitéz for his outstanding military merit and loyalty to the national cause. This honor was followed in the same year by a career step that underlined his close relationship with power, his appointment as deputy chief of the military office of Regent Horthy. During these years, Béla Miklós de Dálnok acted as the perfect tool of the apparatus, a disciplined professional soldier of the old school, who secured the existing order and kept himself distant from the real social problems that were tearing Hungarian society apart. Part 4. Berlin and the involvement in the war. 1933 to 1940. A formative chapter of his career began in 1933. Until 1936, Béla Miklós de Dálnok served as a military attaché in Berlin. From this unique observation post, he experienced the rise of National Socialism and the massive German rearmament at close range. He observed the aggressive nature of the new regime, the rapid militarization of German society, and the expanding power of Hitler. Yet he remained a loyal part of the Hungarian leadership, which maneuvered the country into an ever closer and more dangerous dependence on the Third Reich. After his return to Hungary, his rise continued unabated. In 1939, he was promoted to Major General. When Hungary entered the war against the Soviet Union alongside the Axis powers in 1941, Béla Miklós de Dálnok commanded the so-called Fast Brigade. For his military successes on the Eastern Front, particularly during the early advances into Soviet territory, he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in October 1941. At this point, he was deeply entangled in the war machinery. He was a general who carried out orders without openly questioning their moral consequences or the looming historical catastrophe for Hungary. Only when the military situation at the front became hopeless after the disaster at Stalingrad did doubts about the previous strategy begin to emerge. Doubts that were primarily born of the threat of total defeat and the fear of coming ruin. Part 5. Political Paralysis and the Defection. 1941 to 1944. The years 1942 to 1944 were marked by increasing isolation for Béla Miklós de Dálnok within the Hungarian General Staff. As commander of the 1st Hungarian Army, he was directly confronted with the overwhelming force of the Soviet offensive in 1944. He was among the first in the high command to realize that the Carpathian passes could not be held against the Red Army. He saw the technical and numerical superiority of the Soviet forces and recognized the futility of the German defense strategy. Yet at this point, his political indecisiveness showed once again. He was not a man of active resistance. While German troops occupied Hungary in March 1944, an event known as Operation Margaret, he remained at his post. He stayed a functioning part of the occupation order as the country plummeted into chaos and the mass deportation of its citizens began. He was a general caught between his oath to Horthy and the reality of a lost war. October 15, 1944, finally marked the ultimate turning point. Regent Horthy announced the armistice on the radio, but the simultaneous coup by the Arrow Cross under Ferenc Szalasi destroyed all hopes for a peaceful exit. Béla Miklós de Dálnok received the order from the new fascist regime to continue the fight to the last man. Only in this moment of absolute desperation did he make the break. On October 16th, he left his headquarters with a small circle of his staff and surrendered to Soviet captivity. However, his call to the soldiers of the First Hungarian Army to stop fighting remained largely without resonance. The German control over the units was already too tight, and the fear of reprisals was too great. He had lost all real influence over his troops. He was now a general without an army, needed in Moscow as a political instrument to give a future government the appearance of bourgeois legitimacy. Part 6. Negotiations in Moscow and impotence in Debrecen. 1944 to 1945. In Moscow, Béla Miklós de Dálnok became a pawn in the high-stakes game of great power politics. He found himself forced to negotiate with the Hungarian communists living in exile, men like Mátyás Rákosi and Ernő Gerő, whom he had regarded as the ultimate enemies of the state all his life. In these talks, he proved to be an uncertain and weak figure who could hardly assert any demands of his own. The Soviet leadership, under the watchful eye of Stalin, saw him merely as a useful bourgeois figurehead to simulate national unity and continuity to the world public and the Western Allies. In December 1944, he was elected Prime Minister of the Provisional National Government in Debrecen. But this office was a mere formality from the very beginning. Béla Miklós de Dálnok possessed no political organization of his own, no party, and no loyal administrative staff. He was completely dependent on the support of the National Independence Front, in which the communist forces already held the organizational and police upper hand. He was a prime minister by the grace of others. His most significant official act was the signing of the armistice agreement in Moscow in January 1945, in which he had to accept harsh conditions, including reparations and the active participation of Hungarian units against Germany, conditions he could hardly influence in detail. He was the administrator of a collapse, whose room for maneuver was extremely limited from the start by the Soviet occupation power and the brutal dynamics of internal Hungarian power struggles. Part 7. Land Reform and the Final Decline. 1945 to 1947. A defining element of his short and difficult term in office was the implementation of the land reform of 1945. This was a radical intervention in the centuries-old social structure of Hungary. Although Béla Miklós de Dálnok signed the decrees that broke the power of the large landowners and redistributed land to millions of peasants, he was not the initiator of this transformation. He acted as the executive organ of a development he could no longer stop and which actually contradicted his own social and military upbringing. He was the bourgeois curtain behind which the radical and eventually total transformation of the Hungarian state into a socialist republic was prepared. Following the elections in November 1945, where the Smallholders Party won a landslide victory, his political importance finally faded into insignificance. He was replaced as prime minister by Zoltán Tildy. Béla Miklós de Dálnok later tried to find a new political home in the Independence Party of Dezső Fefer, a group characterized in our source as reactionary and counter-revolutionary. But in the rapidly consolidating new system, where the communists used salami tactics to eliminate one opponent after another, there was no longer room for a man of his origin. In 1947, his parliamentary mandate was declared null and void by the election committee, which meant the final ignominious end of his political career. He had failed politically even before the new system dropped him completely. He remained an isolated and watched figure, a relic of an era that had irrevocably come to an end. Part 8. The Lonely End and the Conclusion. The life of Béla Miklós de Dálnok ended on November 21st, 1948. After 3 severe heart attacks, he died in Budapest. Almost forgotten by the public, he had once served in the highest military and civil offices. He had several times turned down opportunities to emigrate to the West, offered by the International Red Cross, because he did not want to leave his homeland despite his total political isolation and the constant surveillance by the state security. He was buried in a private setting, far from state honors or public recognition. His actions in October 1944 were undoubtedly a necessary step that saved Hungary from even more total destruction and a longer continuation of the war on its soil. But as a political actor, he remained an outsider and a weak figure until the end. He was a representative of the old Hungarian militarism who, in a decisive moment of history, changed sides, but never truly found a place in the new order. His life path is the portrait of a man who rose through discipline and absolute obedience, but could not develop any political power or vision of his own in the storms of history. He was ultimately crushed. Between the fronts he tried to navigate, that was the life story of Béla Miklós de Dálnok, seen through the prism of a significant contemporary document of socialist historiography. What is your opinion on this Prime Minister of the Zero Hour? Was he a tragic realist who tried to save what was left? Or merely an overwhelmed extra of history who was used and then discarded? Feel free to write your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching Hungarology, and see you next time.